So it's my pleasure to introduce Kiran Garimella, who I've known for a few years now. He did a fantastic PhD at Aalto, then he went to EPFL, and then he went to MIT. And in both places, he did fantastic work as well. And now he's joined Rutgers University as an assistant professor. And he's pioneered this line of work looking at WhatsApp and looking at how we can gather content from a supposedly encrypted platform called WhatsApp using public groups. So over to you, Kiran, to tell us about it.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for the invite. Today I'm going to talk about broad summary of our work in this space of WhatsApp specifically, but then think about how you can do this sort of content moderation, right? Like how things like misinformation or fact checking on such encrypted spaces. What are models to do that? So it's going to be about first about why WhatsApp, some motivation on why this platform is important. Then I'll talk about a couple examples of how we used WhatsApp data for some things that are specific to a platform like this, which are different from other traditional social media platforms that we see, like Twitter or Facebook or Reddit. And then I'll talk a bit about this moderation and what are models for that, what have we tried, what is possible, and what are we going to do in the future. So that's kind of the broad agenda. WhatsApp is a one-to-one messaging platform. It's mostly chat-based mobile messaging platform. Roughly 10% of the communication is also through group messaging, one to many. There is, it's very popular, over 2 billion monthly active users. So, a lot of installs on Android. WhatsApp is very special, compared to other social media platforms for three reasons. So one is the demographics of who uses it. Right? So first is it's all these 2 billion users who come who use WhatsApp. Most of them come from the global south. So it's one of these very popular, very dominant social networks in the global south. So for instance, you see some staggering numbers here. 500 million Indians are on WhatsApp. That's more than the population of a lot of countries combined. 100% of internet population in Brazil is on WhatsApp. So this is over 120 million users. And in a lot of these countries, WhatsApp is like a gateway to the internet or a replacement to the internet. Like people do a lot of stuff just on WhatsApp. And a lot of these users are first-time internet users. I mean, this is driven by the cheap smartphone, cheap data revolution. So, Android phones come with WhatsApp pre-installed, like 90% of them. So a lot of these users are first-time internet users. So this kind of demographic is very interesting. And sorry, there's something. Yeah, it's very interesting and novel, which was not previously, online or could be studied in terms of studying social networks, for instance. The second is, what these people use WhatsApp for, right? So I said things about, people, WhatsApp being like a gateway or a replacement for the internet for a lot of people. So yeah, it's one of these, very popular global super apps. That super apps are things like WeChat, for instance, that has a lot of things built in. So WhatsApp is now slowly becoming that, right? So it's an inbuilt social network by default, you communicate with people, but it's also a social network in the sense that people consume information from there, produce information there, but it also has a phone and SMS functionality, right? And it also now has built-in payments infrastructure in it, and people, the app is slowly moving towards more and more functionality in that sense. So it's not just a social network; it's a lot, and it's one of these global super apps. And the third is how it functions. So things like the fact that it is primarily mobile based, right? So all your traditional social networks are primarily desktop based, then ported to mobile, like Facebook or Twitter, whatever. But WhatsApp is primarily mobile based. It's also end-to-end encrypted, which we'll see a couple of examples of why that is really important. The other is it's also, because of this encryption, there are no algorithms, there's no personalization. There's no news feed. It's all user-generated content being consumed as they produce and as they receive it. The final thing is it being, mobile-based chat application being used by first-time internet users, and all these combined. There's lots of multimedia content. So in our data sets that we've collected, roughly 50 to 60% of the content is non-textual. So only half of the content is textual, which is again a very different way of thinking about a social media platform than what we are typically used by. Like most of the social networks are text-based and then have images and video, maybe not things like YouTube, for instance, but this is a lot of images, a lot of emojis, a lot of video, and so on. So that's again a very different way. So of course, with all this like popularity, billions of people using that, you have issues like misinformation. Some examples here: COVID misinformation, for instance, is a huge issue. And then the main thing is the scale, right? Like, so 2 billion people using it, you will have these issues are compounded. Similarly, it's not just the presence of misinformation that's the problem. Misinformation leading to offline violence, right? Like, so things like mob violence because of rumors fueled by WhatsApp. I mean, you cannot have a causal link there, but you can say things like WhatsApp playing a role in the quick amplification of some of these rumors, right? Like, so dozens of people have been killed by rumors like this. So it's not just the threat of misinformation or hate speech; it's a threat of offline violence because of issues that the ecosystem of WhatsApp enables. So, like I said, like that was kind of a quick motivation of why this platform is important. It's interesting. Now let me talk about what you can do for data collection on WhatsApp. What have we done? Why is it not trivial? So if you look at like traditional platforms, again, all your usual platforms, you have the users who produce information, and that is obtained by the platform. They store it, and they give access to that to researchers through certain types of APIs, right? I mean, by the way, I mean, this is the image that comes up when I Google researchers. So yeah, so it's researchers. So you have APIs that platforms might expose, and then you query those, or you scrape them through these websites that these platforms the information that the platforms collect. But in the case of WhatsApp, because of this end-to-end encryption, this model does not work, right? Like, so WhatsApp just acts as a way of delivering information between users. They don't store any content on their servers. I mean, even if they do, it's all encrypted, so they don't know or see what is actually the content being exchanged between users. So the only content that is shared on WhatsApp is on the end user's devices. So if I send you a message, it's only decrypted on my device, it's decrypted on your device, but not anywhere in the middle. So WhatsApp cannot actually expose any APIs or provide any data to researchers. So one way we overcame this is by buying a lot of our own devices, installing WhatsApp on that, joining a lot of WhatsApp groups, collecting a lot of WhatsApp data, and then exporting that, working with that data, right? Like, so that is a model where we bought like 20 cell phones, we joined like tens of thousands of up to 10,000 publicly available WhatsApp groups, and then we exported the database that WhatsApp stores on your phone, which is decrypted, and then you can read the messages and you can process that, work with that. So this is one way that we work with, like collecting data at scale, and this gives us a lot of data, right? Like, so you can scale this up quite easily. So like I said, we did like 10,000 public WhatsApp groups from 3 countries, so India, Brazil, Indonesia, with over 5 million messages, and lots and lots of data, like 10 terabytes, because it has a lot of videos and images and so on. The other way, which is also relevant to that, is this is a new paper which we recently published. So it's about similar mechanism, like where we are part of a group, but these are not publicly available, publicly accessible. What we did here is we actually had an on-ground survey in India, where we went to a political party office and we asked them, hey, we are researchers, would you mind like adding us to your WhatsApp group that your political party manages? I mean, it sounds crazy, but I mean, it's it worked quite well. A lot of the people that we asked were indeed like open to adding us to their WhatsApp groups, like a researcher number, like a phone number, like our WhatsApp number. So that way we could export and again get that data set. And this was in India, like in this northern part called Uttar Pradesh. And overall, we got like over 500 groups and million messages over a long term. And this is again a novel data set that is not trivial to collect, but it gives you a different look at what is happening inside some of these private political WhatsApp groups that we monitor.
Kiran, can I ask a clarification question here? How do you identify which people to approach, and how do you identify who are the admins, and also once you've identified them, do you have a sense of how good your coverage is? So is it that there are about 5,000 and you've got 3,000 of those social media party workers, or
okay, that's a very good question. So we had like a systematic way of approaching. So we went to certain districts in UP. We know where each political party has an office, so we went to each of these offices. So that was kind of complete in that sense. But then, and now in India, like each political party has its own like IT cell or person who manages their social media. We went and asked for that person, like, can we speak to someone like that? And then, based on that, we then asked, okay, can you add us to a WhatsApp, if they manage a WhatsApp group? I mean, there's a huge questionnaire and a process involved in that. Of course, I mean, in the end, we got like this 500 that we got added to. That's probably an extremely biased subsample. Like there could have been much larger sample that we were not added to. So this is not a perfect sample or a random sample in any way. It's a biased sample, but it's still, these are groups that would not have been accessible publicly through links that, for instance, we did in the previous case. So it's somewhat a different view than what we would have gotten if we just focused on like publicly available groups. And then just as a fun fact about this region where we actually did the sampling, so it has a population of 220 million people, which is larger than, so it's this small region here in orange. It has a population larger than all of these countries shown here in purple. It is a surprising fact. Okay, so let's talk about
hand raised as well. Kiran, go ahead.
Hi Kiran. This is Kiran as well from University of Exeter. So I had a related question what Nishant just asked. So the question is, so when you were referring to public WhatsApp groups, and you said you use the means of public platforms where they encouraging people to join them. So how sure are we that these groups are legit or genuine? Because I'm asking this because there are like a lot of public pages which welcome people to join for various reasons, right? And they could be pretending to be somebody else. And for example, I mean, I asked this from a political communication point of view, that it's possible that a group's name could be pro-BJP, but that could be run by a Congress social media cell. So how do you, so I know it's biased and it's still whatever, but how would you handle those things? I'm sorry,
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what happened is we manually, so all these 10,000 links, so we actually collected much bigger set. Like we had like in 60,000 links, and then we manually looked up, like, okay, which of these are actually politically relevant and actually relate to politics and the space that we are specifically looking at, right? Like Brazil, India, or Indonesia. So we had domain experts actually look at them before we joined them. But that said, like you said, the name could say something about it's a pro-BJP group, but inside the content could be an anti-BJP or a spam group or whatever. So that could be possible. That we don't have control over. But the fact that we just had this volume just enabled us to just say, okay, even if there's 10% of the groups are spam, you could just filter them out. So that's the strategy we use. So and overall, like even if something is pro-BJP, like in terms of the title, we are not sure if that is like an official BJP group or if it is just a fan created group and there's some activity there. So we don't have any clear ways to assign saying, okay, this is belongs to this party and managed by this party. So that kind of yeah, we cannot make that sort of assignment based on this large public group sample. So yeah, so these are kind of for sure limitations in the data sample.
Thank you.
And Nishant, did you have any other questions?
No, that's it from me. So carry on. Thanks, Kiran.
Okay. Yeah. So let's then quickly look at a couple of examples of what we did with these types of data sets. And the results are quite very similar in terms of both the public and private group data sets. So I'll just talk about like one of the results in the private group data, or actually a mix of them. But they're roughly similar. One of the factors is that like I said, because of WhatsApp being the sort of mobile based and also because of the demographic, there's a lot of non-textual content. So roughly 40% of the messages in our data set were images. So we specifically focused on understanding misinformation in the form of images. So what we did is we annotated roughly like 40,000 images. So these are randomly sampled for misinformation and hate, among other things. Like we were also just interested in how are these images being used to spread, like what the purpose of these WhatsApp groups, like spread political content, propaganda, things like that. But in this context, like let's focus on misinformation, hate speech. So we have this very large data set manually labeled by local experts, and overall, the finding is that misinformation, the prevalence is low. I mean, which is very similar to what we see globally, right? Like overall prevalence of misinformation on social media is not that big, right? Like so, for instance, the numbers are roughly 3% of the messages of the images that we annotated, and because it's a random sample, this could generalize for the entire data set. So 3% of the images are misinformation. But if you condition on certain factors, right? Like if, for instance, the image is talking about minority groups like Muslims in India, the fraction of misinformation could be much, much higher, right? Like so there's these sorts of things. But in general, the overall amount of misinformation is not that prevalent. And then we looked at like, okay, what is image misinformation, right? Like how are images being misused? And we found like three main categories of misinformation in the form of images. So the first is the sort of memes or images that just have text on them, and mostly they are used to indicate like fake quotations or fake statistics or fake polls and things like that. Again, like these are all political groups, so the misinformation is going to be political. So here is one of the examples. So which says, okay, BBC declared BJP, which is the current party in power, as the most corrupt in the world. Not true. I mean, there's no such survey. This is a fake image, right? Like it's a fake survey. Then there's this other, the second category we found is images taken out of context. So, an old plane crash from 5 years ago, but then claiming to be an Indian plane shot down by Pakistan. This was 4 years ago during the India-Pakistan conflict. And these are what are called cheap fakes. So we see a lot of these even today in this Russian-Ukraine conflict, right? Like a lot of old videos being shared as, this happened in Ukraine today, or some video game videos being shared as, okay, this is happening today, things like that. Just this easy way of repurposing old content, claiming to be content that is produced now, roughly 30% of the content. And this is these are what are called cheap fakes, because this is the counterpart of deep fakes, right? Because deep fakes are really hard to do. They're technically sophisticated. These are like, okay, very simple, right? You just take an old image, reshare it out of context. The third type of images, which are roughly 10%, are photoshopped images. So this is an example. This is claiming to be the largest snake found in the world. Not true. I mean, if you have been on the internet for a while, you can tell that this is a Photoshop. This is clear, but maybe not for the people who are actually using WhatsApp, for the first time, or whatever. But it's not all that simple. I mean, these two are also Photoshopped images. They claim to be breaking news that appeared on the television, right? Like both these, the text here has been photoshopped, right? The text in white. So none of these actually appeared on the television, but the fact that it poses as if these are real news that appear on TV makes them really popular. These are very popular and popularly widely shared in our data set. So roughly 10% of the images are Photoshop, but as you see, none of them are like really high effort, right? Like they just need some basic photoshopping effort. So just to summarize, like image misinformation, images are really important. The overall prevalence is low, but then you can characterize image misinformation into these three types that already cover roughly 70% of the misinformation in our data set. Now let's quickly look at hate speech. Again, like hate speech, as we define it, like personal attacks on specific groups, is not explicitly. I mean, it's not very prevalent, roughly 2%. But again, if you condition on specific communities, like if an image is showing a Muslim, the propensity of an image being hateful is much higher, like roughly 10 times higher. And here we found that there is this specific way of presenting hate speech, which kind of tries to overcome the restrictions of some of these social media platforms, right? Like, so instead of using overtly hateful content, people use this type of fear speech. This we see very regularly. So it's this it's a term used in intergroup conflict research. So it talks about speech that tries to instill fear among the population about a specific minority community. And this is a very common way of not saying something hateful, but saying something fearful. I mean, in the UK, for instance, talking about Muslims is going to be very similar. The rhetoric of Muslims taking over and things like that, it's very similar. So these are two examples of fear speech, of hate speech and fear speech. So the first is a hate speech example. So it was about there were celebrations in Agra when Pakistan won the cricket match against India. That's why I hate Islam. See how these mullahs are celebrating, seditious traitors. So here is clearly saying, okay, Islam, Muslims are traitors, right? Like, so that's clearly hateful. But the second message is an example of what we are talking about. It's called fear speech. In 1378, a part of India separated and became an Islamic nation named Iran, and now other regions of India are on the verge of becoming an Islamic state. If you want give Muslims a good answer, share and educate Hindus. We want to unite Hindus today, right? Like, so something like this, where you don't say anything explicitly hateful, but use this sort of factual inaccuracies and mix of that to say create this fear of Muslims taking over, or the fact that they're being partially given over preference by the state or things like that, right? Like, so this sort of fear rhetoric is very common. So it's 1/5 of the messages that mention Muslims in our data set have this sort of rhetoric. So we see clear examples of like coordinated posting of not just posting, but coordinated way of actually preparing these sorts of messages that set this narrative. And it is really hard to automatically flag these using techniques that we know for detecting hate speech. So one of the contributions in this work was to actually devise this large data set of tens of thousands of such messages, where we annotated them and then build some of these NLP models, like all the transformer-based models that do decently well at detecting this type of speech. Okay, so that was the second example. Let's look at the final example of what could be done with data set that is specific, that are issues that are specific to a platform like WhatsApp. So the third is cross-platform information campaigns. So this is about making use of WhatsApp groups to impact trending topics on Twitter. And the way this works is it's this way, right? Like, this is a screenshot from one of the groups that we are monitoring. Like I said, we monitored thousands of such WhatsApp groups, and there are in fact tens of thousands, if not more, such WhatsApp groups created by political parties in India. And the message reads, let's together trend this hashtag, like a specific hashtag, to demonstrate our support for the Prime Minister. And the message also has a link to a Google Doc. So, and the Google Doc looks like this. The Google Doc has a hashtag, a date and time, and a lot of example tweets. So this Google Doc, for instance, has over 100 example tweets that contain that hashtag. And the manipulation here is that people just coordinated in a coordinated fashion, copy paste this tweets containing this hashtag onto their profile at this time, right? Like on 19th March 2019, all these people from the thousands of WhatsApp groups that the party maintains, they just get this link, they just copy paste a random tweet from this, post it onto their profile. And here's how it looks in practice, right? Like if you take this first example from this Google Doc, we see, if you search on Twitter, it's just the same tweet being copy pasted by a random set of, supporters for the party, right? Like you see, some of them did some minor modifications, right? Like so this person added an image, this person added an image, this person added some other mentions. Similarly, right? If you take the second example, you have similarly, again, hundreds of people copy pasting the same. So if you take, 100 example tweets from that Google Doc, you have a few hundred people copy pasting that. That's already thousands of tweets containing that hashtag. And Twitter thinks that these are, this is real interest on this hashtag, and the hashtag gets trending. So that's the manipulation. And these are all, like, it's not an automated campaign. This is a manually driven campaign. These are all real accounts, real people that tweet something else, all the time. Otherwise, I mean, they're just copy pasting this as part of their support to the party, but these are not bots. For instance, you see, there are 2 verified accounts here. There are also verified accounts here. So these are all real, some of them are high profile, like members of parliament and so on, but they do this sort of activity. And they're very effective. So roughly, 69 of the 75 campaigns we monitored. So we monitored 75 such Google Docs and monitored, okay, what are the hashtags that they wanted to use and how did they trend on the day they were supposed to be trending. Roughly 90% of the hashtags were actually trending. So this is a very successfully run campaign. And around 40% of the tweets in each campaign were new tweets that were not from, just give me a second, from that Google Doc, right? Like, so people saw this campaign and saw that it was trending and added their new tweets that were not from that Google Doc. Yeah, so go ahead.
Hi, Kiran. Yeah, sorry, I had a follow-up question. Like, did you have a chance to look at the timing of it? I mean, I could see some outliers there. I think if you go back to your previous slides, the same content was pasted as early as January 29th, and then this was trended probably on 18th or 19th of March. That's what I suppose. Because I mean, I have looked at the trends during the 2019 elections, and this particular hashtag, Modi Mein Hai Dam. So this was particularly aimed during the campaign. And so did you have a chance to look at the timing of these trends and how much of it was corroborating with the evidence you found? With Twitter? Yeah.
So yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, a very good find as well. So it seems like, for instance, the same tweet was used with other hashtags in the past. Like, I think this hashtag was also trended in the past, like in January 2029. And I think the people who were preparing these Google Docs, they just copy pasted the same tweet and then changed the hashtag. So it seems like, yeah, this is a repeated thing that happens. But yeah, we also looked at like how these campaigns evolve, like what fraction of them are actually real tweets from real users versus copy pasted users. And we find some really nice trends. So it all starts with like these what we call template tweets that people copy paste, and then you see the new tweets emerging from users who find it from from the trending page. So yeah, we have some analysis in our paper. So if you want, you can take a look at that, or I can provide you the paper. But the thing is, once we find these campaigns, you can build some machine learning models to detect like such automated campaigns. And we found that over 1,000 campaigns have been run using such a technique over the last 3 years or so. And it's still running. Like even today, like these sorts of campaigns, they run and they get trending. And in India, like a lot of these trending topics are just based on such simple copy pasting mechanisms, and a lot of different political parties also do it now. And the problem with this is it's just algorithmic amplification, right? Like it's a very simple problem to identify. Just if you deduplicate all your tweets for a hashtag, when you're counting the trending volume, it'll just mitigate this. But yeah, of course, Twitter does not do that. Okay, so that was the second part where we talked about a couple of examples of what you could do with this sort of data, right? Like we looked at image misinformation, we looked at fear speech, we looked at sort of cross-platform coordination. So now let's look at what you can do about this. So how can we develop, moderation solutions in this sort of end-to-end encrypted setting? And the issue with an end-to-end encrypted setting is, that's very different from other platforms, right? Like, so on Twitter or Facebook, you can just hire centrally a set of moderators who look at, flagged content, and then you build machine learning models on top of these labels. WhatsApp is, because of end-to-end encryption, they don't see the content that is spreading. You only know, I sent a message to someone else, but you don't know what the actual content of that was. Like, was it hateful? Was it misinformation? WhatsApp cannot see that. So there's no way you can do central content moderation. So one thing you can do is, the sort of bottom-up user-driven moderation, which is, what we call a tip line. So what we did is, set up a WhatsApp number to which WhatsApp users can forward these tips to. So for instance, here's, one of our numbers where, someone got this message. It says, dangerous cosmic rays will pass through the earth. Please keep your mobile switched off. And these are very, very common, these types of messages on WhatsApp. This person forwards us that number, that message. And we built some technology to check this automatically and send back the results back to the user. And this kind of can scale up the technology in an end-to-end encrypted setting, right? Like, so if you have multiple thousands of users, so this tip line had actually this was run during the Indian election, again, 2019. It had roughly 100,000 messages by a few 10,000 users. This was again, widely advertised by WhatsApp, national, international media. And then we built technology on top of that. It's currently live and serving 6 languages, not just in India, but in Mexico and Brazil also. And the technology is very simple. So we get tips from users. We do some pre-processing, right? So clustering them, checking if the item has already been fact-checked. If the item has already been fact-checked, you send the fact-check back to the user. Like, this is the bot that just replies and says, okay, this is false, and this is what the result is. If the item has not been fact-checked, you send it to a journalist on our team who does the fact-checking, send it back to the user, right? Like, this is the pipeline. And usually the huge bottleneck here is the human, right? Like, so humans who, this is the place that takes a lot of time. So ideally we want, messages to have this sort of matching so we can quickly send them back to the user. So the technology we built is just, finding similar messages. So the messages can be worded differently, or the images can be slightly edited in a way. So can we find these sorts of near similar messages, near similar images, and say these are all the same messages that have already been fact-checked, and send that back to the user. So that's kind of what we did in this setup. Okay, so but the issue with this is, like I said, like, even though this was very widely advertised by WhatsApp, not many people use it, right? Like, only a few tens of thousands of people use it out of the 500 million users in India, right? Like, it's not an easy process that so it's not scalable beyond a set of enthusiasts who have interest in the fact that, okay, they might be receiving misinformation that they want to have corrected, which is a very, very small bias sample of users. So the other approach that you could think of is somehow more top-down, where you say, you push a solution to the user and say everyone will use it as part of the app. Okay, this is a proposal where, so the idea is, again, in an end-to-end encrypted setup, user 1 sends a message to user 2. It's encrypted on the user's device before it is sent to the WhatsApp server, decrypted on the user's device again before the user can see it. So if you can do some scanning on the device of a user, right? Like, so you have, let's say, a database of already fact-checked content, you push that onto the user's device, and before the content is encrypted, you kind of do this fact-checking on the device of a user. Like, in this case, it can work without breaking the encryption. And we see that, roughly, a lot of the misinformation in our data set, if you implemented this kind of setup, could be prevented, right? Like, 80% of the image shares, of misinformation image shares, could have been prevented if you implemented this kind of a setup, or 35% of the text message shares, which is quite a bit, right? Like, it's a lot of misinformation that could be prevented if you had this sort of on-device setup, which said, okay, this has already been fact-checked, so you don't cannot share this image further. And of course, these are slightly upper bound on one data set, but it's just an estimate. But the issue is that, this is not practical, right? Like, so there's, we published this in 2019, I think, and after that, Apple implemented something similar, or like on-device scanning for child sexual abuse detection. There's a lot of blowback and a lot of discussion in the community. This is the guy who runs WhatsApp, head of WhatsApp. So he talks about, okay, how WhatsApp will never adopt such a system, and it's practical, right? Like, it's, you don't have, for instance, Apple scanning your content of your laptop, right? Or Microsoft scanning your Windows laptop, right? Like, so similarly, why would you allow WhatsApp to scan your phone, or what Apple to scan your iPhone, whatever, right? Like, so that kind of is the argument that these people make. It's not privacy preserving in a sense. So, this is not probably practical, right? Like, so we looked at two solutions. One is this bottom-up approach where users do want to have content fact check, like crowdsourcing, but that's not scalable. We looked at this top-down solution, which is where platforms can actually implement something, but have the sort of privacy issues. So what can you do, right? Like, so this top-down solution always has these sorts of privacy issues. Like, anything the WhatsApp can do that either looks at the content or tinkers with any of that will interfere with the privacy that, the promise that they're making for privacy for the users. So, maybe we should think about like scaling up these are the bottom-up approaches. So one of the things you could do is, you could, instead of having every user send a message to us, right? Like, as is in fact checkers or journalists, where the pool is limited, you could have, identify trusted sources within a person's network, things like family, friends, or community leaders, and have some of them fact check. This is, an ongoing project that we're working on right now, where, connecting fact checkers to diaspora communities in the US. So the issue there is, in the US, WhatsApp is not really widely used, but diaspora communities, immigrant communities use WhatsApp quite a bit, and they don't have any mechanism to fact check content that spreads in their communities. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that, for instance, the Spanish community in the US has been targeted with disinformation during the last elections, especially on WhatsApp, but they don't have tools to fact check any of that content. So in this case, the idea was to build this sort of bottom-up fact-checking solutions. So the idea was, instead of directly interfacing with the community, where you ask people to send us tips, you can work with some sort of community leaders that you can pick. And this is, the part of the project where we're actually interviewing community leaders and asking, if they would use some of the tools that we build, and then let that scroll down to the users. The community leaders then forward that content to their communities, because these are trusted sources. But the idea is, does this actually generalize to billions of users, right? Like, so you have 2 billion users, like, are all people part of these communities? Probably not, right? Like, I'm not part of the Indian American community. I don't have a community leader that I trust that I could get this information from. So how do you identify these sorts of trusted sources? Who should do this sort of fact checking? Like I said, there are other networks that people could be part of that could be made use of, but that's an open question, right? Like, so just the last slide. So in general, I talked a lot about, like, okay, WhatsApp and that one specific platform, but some of these findings or some of these questions and the general setup is not necessarily specific to WhatsApp, right? Like, and if you think about privacy on social networks and the role of platforms as a general question, right? Like, so encryption just enforces the fact that the platforms cannot look at the content, but we can also think of other platforms where you can say, okay, I don't want Facebook to look at my content. How do you design these sorts of content moderation solutions for that, right? Or actually, Facebook was thinking of moving to this completely encrypted, all encryption, all their platforms, like Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp, but they backed down. But something like that could be in the future. Or you have other platforms like Telegram or Signal, or some of these lesser known platforms that have similar issues. So you should care about that. The second is thinking about should we even moderate, right? Like, so it's all private. Like, do we even care about, like, should we moderate at all? But the problem is, things like these at scale, right? Like at this billions of users scale, these platforms have these spillover effects offline. So you have that sort of that sort of balance you have to maintain. Okay, is privacy important? But then is also offline harm caused by these platforms, like responsibility of the platforms to moderate. The third is, things like, okay, free speech versus fear speech, right? Like, so this sort of fear speech, once we develop some models for detecting that, okay, but then what would you do about that in practice? Like, this is not going to, it's not something hateful. Like, do you want to moderate that, right? Like in context of places like, okay, India, obviously, but Myanmar, we have seen, for instance, some of the genocides that happen, and there again, the rhetoric begins with something like this, right? Like creating this environment of fear. And finally, okay, thinking about like what are better models to do this sort of scaling up of the bottom-up approaches. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kiran. I see a couple of hands that have come up. Ralph, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have two questions which are slightly different. One is, how do you, or have you attempted to kind of measure the impact? You were talking about, I think, 1 million images, out of which 3.3 are harmful in some cases, and 27,000 posts are fear speech. How do you assess the impact of like 27,000 out of 1 million? Because what are the other images, other messages doing? My second question goes into a slightly different direction, which is, one solution that one might think is, why don't you shame Facebook or the company running WhatsApp into saying, you guys are producing this, and widely publicizing it, and really making a public campaign to say, we're going to publicize this as widely as possible, and you better clean it up. Sorry to put it in such crude terms, but I'm sure the thought has occurred to you. And what's the obstacle to doing it? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, in measuring impact, again, like this is a very fundamental problem to this sort of encrypted, like closed messaging platforms. So I mean, there are no measures of like counts or share counts or those things, right? Like unless, I mean, just because we collected this message of millions of messages, we can see, okay, how many times was this image shared, how many times were these different messages shared, and you can measure some sort of, okay, just by repetition, like how many times were these shared, but that does not tell you anything about like exposure in general outside of our population. So measuring the actual impact is really hard. So yeah, like you said, like is, for instance, 3% a lot? Is 3% too little? That, yeah, it's really hard unless we can do like some sort of like survey also of the users and asking whether, for instance, these 3% are much more impactful and have actually led them to decide or believe upon certain facts more than the rest 97%. So just as a side note on that, the one of the major findings of our work, where we annotated all these tens of thousands of images, is that a small percent of them are hate speech or misinformation, but a lot of them are, like, roughly 40% of it is just general local information, just local political information. Oh yeah, we had this party meeting today with 10 people, here are the pictures. We had this inauguration of a temple, or there's a pothole in the road, be careful, or things like that, like very local information that's being shared, like a typical like social network, right? Because most of that is just that sort of static information. But yeah, we don't know about impact. That's a very good question. I don't know how to think about it unless you really can connect some sort of surveys with this sort of observational kind of data. The other is about the role of WhatsApp or Facebook. One of that is there is no alternative here, right? Like, so if I propose saying WhatsApp should do something, what is my proposal there? There's no concrete proposal that we can put as researchers saying WhatsApp should do this, right? Like Facebook, it's an open platform. There we can have some saying, you release your data to researchers who can audit this and do this and that. But for WhatsApp, it's all encrypted. So their answer is just that, yeah, it's all encrypted. Do you want privacy, or do you want us to look at your data and not do privacy, right? Like, so that's kind of the the argument that exists out there. Like especially the UK government is really pushing for giving the sort of encryption keys for especially the sort of child sexual abuse and breaking encryption for just that one purpose. The UK government is actually pushing a lot for that. But I think WhatsApp is saying, we respect privacy. Privacy is a fundamental. That line of argument, which you cannot. It's a moral argument that you cannot say, okay, not important in these cases, and how do you make sure that it's only the encryption is broken only for these specific sub cases of child sexual abuse, right? So that there's no clear solution that can be proposed as an alternative. So that's
if I can just follow up, but these are all public groups, right? So clean up the public square would be. The public square is not private.
Yeah. So
arguably, these are difficult questions, I realize, but that would be a way to make the argument. No,
not necessarily. Again, like WhatsApp. So these public groups, we were able to get the content and actually study them because we were part of these groups and we built this infrastructure, whatever. WhatsApp cannot even see these, or that's what they claim. They cannot even monitor or see content even posted in public groups because it's all encrypted. So they say we don't look at any content at all, be it public defined in a certain way, like accessible through a link or not. Like they don't look at any content. That's their take on this.
So I see Kiran's hand raised, but there's also another question in the chat from Anushka. So maybe we can take the chat first and then to Kiran.
Sure.
Do you want me to read it out, Kiran? Or
I can read it out. So it says, okay, is it possible to to fuse the two solutions provided? Introduce a plugin where users can feel, if they want to have something fact checked rather than send it to a particular person. So you can do content moderation or ML on the device, or mark it as fake. Yeah, this is a very interesting suggestion. Like I think WhatsApp does something like this. Like they recently provided these tools where you can quickly reverse image search an image, right? Like so you can just click a button and then it takes you to Google and the reverse image searches and checks whether where you can check whether it has already been published somewhere else, or if it has already been fact checked and things like that. I think WhatsApp can do a lot more there, but and that's only in the hands of WhatsApp. So these sorts of solutions could be again, they're top down, but they should come from WhatsApp, and we don't have like a control of like implementing or testing how well these work, right? Like again, think about the demographic and the population that's going to use these. Like would they be digitally literate in a way that they would know what to fact check, even like what is fact checking and things like that, right? Like so I'm not sure, but this is a good suggestion. I think people at WhatsApp are also probably thinking about this.
Now Kiran Basavaraj has a question.
Hi Kiran, thanks so much. That was great work. And so I have like two questions related to the studies and one related to ethics. So the first question related to the study is, so of the WhatsApp groups you have studied, how many of them were like homogeneous, like were they like purely homogeneous, or whether there was cross posting or cross cutting of posts which were happening? So did you happen to see that? So that was question number one. The second one is, WhatsApp has this, the status, the feature of status, right? Adding an image, like how you have reels in Instagram. So how, because I have observed like a lot of people tend to post things on statuses, and that can not be just photographs. It can vary from text and to memes, as you said, and the kind of images you were showing earlier. So it can also have such content. But has there been an attempt to capture those, or does web scraping allow you to get those content? I don't know. And then the third one was related to ethics. So how did you get the IRB clearance? Because I couldn't get it. And what ethics did you like happen to follow, or like what was the process? If you can enlighten me on that. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. Great questions again. So homogeneous in terms of political content, right? That's what you meant?
Yes. Yeah.
So most of these groups are just echo chambers. So they're just one political party. They're speaking their own, or they're trumpeting their own sides. There's very little chance of cross speak, or if someone posts misinformation that Modi is the whatever UNESCO recognized Modi as the best leader, there's very little chance that someone will say this is false. Like I mean, it's all an echo chamber where there's no cross discussion, or people from other parties, and that sort of a thing is not really common. So yeah, I mean, maybe there might be, we did not see it widely spread, but maybe sometimes there might be some of these counter voices or voices of reason, but it's not widespread. The second is, this sort of ephemeral content, right? Like statuses or these things, they just stay until like for one day and then disappear. That's a very big problem in general, right? Like on Instagram or on Snapchat, or everyone has stories these days. So that is also something we thought about, but those are very hard to collect, because you can only access a person's stories if you add them in your context, they add you in their context. So it should be both ways for you to see their stories, or for them to see my stories. So this cannot be scaled at this stage where, like, I mean, here we had like 350,000 users in our data set. So if you have for them to add us to their context, again, that's not possible. So that's not at least scalable. But I agree that that could be one source of misinformation that is not being studied. Even
because
I haven't seen.
Yeah, sorry to intervene, because I asked that because a recent incident in Karnataka where a Hindu boy was killed was basically what the newspaper report says based on the statuses, WhatsApp status, and kind of attacks which was happening. So that's been one of the potential place where the violence or the hate speech or the fear speech, whatever is happening. So I know it's since you're only focusing on private and public WhatsApp groups, and unless they are in my contact list, I can't see the stories. But yeah, as you said, that's a challenge. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the very important question of ethics and IRB. Okay. So I mean, on a light note, like MIT IRB is like exponentially simpler than all the other IRBs that I've been through. So this was exempt. So we did not go through. I mean, it's not human subjects because there's publicly available data, whatever. But that's debatable. That probably you wouldn't consider. I mean, other institutes would not consider to be exempt or not human subjects. But yeah, in general terms, like we thought a lot about how ethical is this, like what are actually good practices to collect this type of data. So one thing is you're becoming a part of a group. Like so one thing we did is we in our WhatsApp profile we said, okay, this is a researcher account, we're going to collect data, but we not explicitly announce that in the group. Again, announcing is both could be ethical or not, right? Like you're interfering with the flow of the group. Is that ethical or not? But yeah, we did not explicitly announce that. Some people did, like I think a group at Oxford did, and they had some different experience. The other is also ethics in terms of like who you get permission from, right? Like, so one way we did from these private groups is just get permission from the admin. Is that enough? Like if the group has 200 people, do we get permission from all 200 people? Also, some of these groups are very dynamic, so people join, leave. So how do you, if you take permission once, like how does it happen over time? Right? There are no best practices that exist out in this space. So this maybe the crowdsourced option, for instance, that was opt-in, more targeted. So that's probably a much more relevant way of collecting data, but that does not give you that sort of scale. And a lot of these problems, you do not get insights about the platforms. You don't have this sort of scale. So yeah, so the actual ethics of this is not completely agreed upon. I mean, there's some work that talks about, okay, these are the possible ways you can do things, like how ethical is each of those. But yeah, there's no agreed upon practice there.
Thank you.
That's very interesting because you never know if does the admin have full control over what the group is, and are you implicitly agreeing to the terms of the group? And clearly, when you join a group, you don't sign off on a privacy policy or whatever, right? So what are the participants really agreeing to when they join such groups? So it's a interesting question.
I mean, also just one small thing, it is not against the terms of service. So WhatsApp terms of service allows this, right? Like, so you can be a part of the group. If you're part of the group, you can export all the messages and download them. So that's what we did, but in an automated fashion. So it doesn't break the terms of service. Yeah.
That's important as well. So any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Mhm.
Just a thought, maybe. So given that we are not talking about ethics, so suppose like if you're able to collect WhatsApp status or other kind of stories, so would it be unethical basically to retain such kind of data as well? Because it's meant to be deleted after 24 hours. So I think although it could be a very interesting line of work, but it has different set of ethics involved as well. What's your opinion?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, that's something I thought of in the context of like Instagram stories, which are public. Like you can view them, but yeah, can you store them beyond the 24 hours that the author actually meant them to be stored for? Probably not. Like that's not ethical, I think. I don't know what, I mean, you could do some sort of pre-processing on the data as you collect them and store some metadata, but maybe not the actual content.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions from anyone else? If not, let's thank Kiran for his fantastic talk. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Great questions. Yeah. Bye.
Bye for now.